Good evening. Welcome to the program. Glad you're with us. Going to be joined tonight by Robert Spencer of jihadwatch.org. Jihadwatch.org. Robert Spencer. Also going to be joined tonight by Josh Yoder, the president of one of the airline organizations, to talk about what's happening with some of our airlines and our airline pilots and all the near misses. Are they hiring substandard pilots? And then, well, I guess you're going to have a big problem with pilots when they all start dying in the cockpit, which many of them are from the COVID shot, the clot shot. They're going to be joined by Dr. Rob Lindstedt, and then I have a little presentation of something I've worked on the last few days I want to present to you that I think might help you understand what is happening to America and why. Joining me first is Robert Spencer. He is the author of many books, but he's got a brand new one out called The Sumter Gambit. The Sumter Gambit, how the left is trying to foment a civil war. There you go. Well, he's absolutely right about that. Robert, welcome back to the broadcast. Thanks for joining us.
Great to talk to you always, Brannon. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, as always. A great job on this new book. I guess folks are probably kind of shocked that you wrote this because this doesn't fall always into your category, but of course, you know what the red-green axis, that's all about pushing us into this corner. So it is right in your wheelhouse, whether people know it or not, right?
Yeah, I've been talking about jihad because it's a threat to freedom, a threat to the free society that we are blessed to enjoy in the United States. But really, everybody knows right now the more immediate threat is coming from the American left and their socialist, internationalist, globalist plans to destroy America as a nation state, impose an authoritarian regime. And so the new book is all about that. I think a lot of times people who are patriots, they deal with the symptoms. The open border is one, the collapse of the national defense and the politicization of the military is another, and so on. But not often enough do we speak about how these things are all tied together and what the left's overall goal is. And so that's what the Sumter Gambit is all about.
Yeah, well, good. I'm going to promote it. As you know, you're in a couple of my documentaries, Sabotage, and then my one from December 2019. If you guys want to show it, you can watch an hour of it for free at siegethemovie.com, siegethemovie.com. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because the subtitle of that, and this came out December 2019, the subtitle, The Clear and Present Danger is Pushing America to the Brink of a Marxist Islamic Revolution, Civil War, World War III, and globalism. Robert, some people thought that subtitle was a little over the top, and even a couple conservatives said, are you sure you want to use the word civil war in there? I said, absolutely, why would you not? And now you've got a great book out explaining exactly. You and I are on the same page is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it's become much more obvious than it was in 2019, but this is a long-standing effort. The left is trying to push us into a civil war because they think they can use it as a pretext to justify their claims that we are traitors and insurrectionists and so on, and use that to clamp down further and impose more of their authoritarian plan.
Yeah. All right. So why did you name it why is the title that you chose? What does that mean?
Yeah, it refers obviously to Fort Sumter, where the first Civil War started. And Fort Sumter was the site of the first Civil War because it was kind of a dilemma. President Abraham Lincoln either had to accept, essentially, that the South was a separate country and give up Fort Sumter, or he had to reinforce it knowing that the South would fire upon it and that would start the war. And in the same kind of way, the left is now trying to push us into a situation that they think will be a win-win situation for them, that they either push their radical agenda upon us and we just take it. And so we have drag queens in primary schools, we have men thinking they're women and you can't say that they're not really women, or you'll be silenced and deplatformed and called a bigot and suffer all kinds of professional harm. You have to, in other words, we either have to just go along and take all this insanity, or if we resist, then they can say, see, they really are insurrectionists. We need to suspend civil liberties. We need to outlaw so-called hate speech and make sure that these people have no platform, with the outcome being that only their point of view is heard and America is dead as a free society. So they think that's a win-win situation. Either they impose their agenda without us fighting back, or they use our fighting back as a means to clamp down further.
Wow. So it's a gaslighting of the American people, gaslighting the American people, trying to get a reaction, then use the reaction as justification for your tyranny.
Exactly. And so what we have to do is, in every possible way, we have to fight back peacefully and legally, but understanding that every one of us now has to become an activist. Nobody is going to do this for us. Nobody can sit back and say, well, we have the military or something like that. This is not that kind of a war. And if we don't fight it and every citizen doesn't fight it, then we really will lose our freedoms at this point.
Let's go to the table of contents here. Well, I thought it was the table of contents. It's not. Let me go to a quote. David Horowitz. Robert Spencer is a national treasure and one of the few conservative writers whose language and tone rise to the gravity of the future we face. Arm yourself with this insightful, truthful, and immensely disturbing book. Why is the book so disturbing? What aspects of it do you think jump out at you when you're writing and researching for it?
Well, I think that the main thing is that this is all being planned. It's a lot more obvious right now that this is all being planned than it was when I was writing the book, but it was clear. And I think it would be clear to anybody when they read the book and anybody when they look at the situation that this is all being planned. What I'm referring to, for example, is suddenly, by total coincidence, there are all these hazardous materials being released into the atmosphere with train derailments and accidents of various kinds, one after the other. Not one, not two, not three, but all over the place, all over the country, all at once. That kind of thing, that's not just some wild coincidence. That is somebody coordinating efforts to destabilize the governments, that is local and state governments, to make them more dependent upon the federal authorities, to instill in the population a sense of an ongoing and never-ending emergency, once again, where we have to depend upon the federal authorities. Every last thing is designed to increase our dependence upon the federal government and to remove or weaken our loyalties to anything else. Anything else.
Wow. So let's talk about a couple articles over at jihadwatch.org while we have you here. Here's one. Sweden, 2 Muslim migrants accused of keeping 3 high school girls as sex slaves. That's permissible, is it not, in Islam?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's abundantly attested in the Quran. You can see it in chapter 4, verse 3, where it refers to the sex slaves as captives of the right hand, and it's very clear in other passages, 424, 23, 1-6, 3350. I'm giving the citation so people can check my work, and I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. It's unbelievable. People think it can't possibly be that this is in the Quran, but it is. That it's permissible for Muslim men to take non-Muslim women as sex slaves, and that this is happening in Europe right now on a very frequent basis. And it all actually ties together here again, Brannon, in exactly the way I'm talking about. These things are not happening by accident. Why is Europe being flooded with Muslims right now? Because the left loves Islam and the left loves open borders. But why does the left love Islam? Because Islam lends itself both to hatred of Judeo-Christian ethics and traditions, and it is an authoritarian religion that instills total obedience even to a tyrant. And so if you have a bunch of globalist socialist internationalists who want to establish an international authoritarian regime, then they know they can't stamp out religion, but they can overwhelm the Judeo-Christian tradition with Islam that will instill into the populace docility toward the tyrants. And that's just, of course, what they want to inculcate.
What do you make of the Iranian that was found shoved into a trunk of a car coming over the southern border a couple weeks ago? I mean, if he wanted to walk across the border, he could have done it like everybody else. Why do you think he was hiding in the trunk of a car? What does that tell you?
Well, in that case, there's any number of possibilities. It could be that he thought that he had a better chance sneaking in, that being from Iran, people would think it was suspicious, and the situation in Iran being so antagonistic with the United States, he couldn't easily go through normal channels if he didn't have an immediate case to make about his life being in danger. On the other hand, he could just be a jihad terrorist. It's certainly jihad terrorists are taking advantage of the open southern border. There were 98 people on the terror watch list who were apprehended last year at the southern border. That's way up from previous years. It's very clear that jihad terrorists from all over the world, Brannon, are aware that the border is open and they're taking advantage.
Are you shocked we haven't had another major terrorist attack? Are you expecting another major terrorist attack? What time frame, if you are? Or are you thinking we're going to see smaller scale but more frequent smaller scale terrorist attacks? In other words, big ones or a lot of smaller, devastating ones?
I think it's going to be a lot of smaller ones of varying degrees, and that's based on several things. One is Al Qaeda and ISIS both have called for those kinds of attacks repeatedly in Europe and the United States. And they're going on all over Europe, where you have a guy who just goes out into the town square or into a shopping mall and starts to stab people at random. We're going to see a lot more of that. They don't want the large-scale attacks. I'm not saying one will never happen, but they don't want the large-scale attacks, and we have not seen one since 9/11, because 9/11 did bring a lot of law enforcement scrutiny upon them, and a lot of high-level operatives ended up getting caught who might not have. Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, for example, was the leading moderate Muslim in the United States in the 1990s. He is now in prison for financing al-Qaeda. He might still be in Washington shaking hands with presidents and influencing policy if it hadn't been for 9/11 and everything that was triggered by it.
Wow. I was reading an article about Salman Rushdie the other day. Remind our audience, this is the man that wrote a book that offended the Islamists back in what, the late 80s, early 90s, somewhere in there?
Late 80s.
Late 80s.
It was February 15th, 1989. He was given a death fatwa by the Islamic Republic of Iran.
And he, I think, kind of went underground for a while, hid out for a while, then said, phooey. And I read an article about him. I can't remember what publication I read it about him in the last month or so, but it was a very exhaustive article about him. And he was basically walking about, going to dinner and everything in New York for about 20 years. People were afraid to be around him. Some people didn't like it when he would come into the restaurant. They felt like they were putting him at risk. I'm like, how could he be putting them at risk if Islam's so peaceful? The same people that thought that he was putting them at risk were the same ones telling us how peaceful Islam is. How stupid is that, right? But I read that some people were like, you're kind of putting us all at risk here, But he was going around, going to different things, social events, restaurants, everybody. He was kind of a fixture for 20 years. He wasn't too worried about it. Then, of course, he went to speak last summer and got stabbed by a guy with Iranian connections, correct? About 12, 15 times, lost an eye, and got a lot of nerve damage and whatnot. But, wow, 20 years. They waited 20 years. Why?
Yeah, they waited longer, actually, because the fatwa, as I noted, was issued in 1989. And so it's been 33 years, 34 years. I'm sorry, I know I'm getting the math wrong, but it's been a long time. And he really did think that there was no problem. And even though they always repeated, the Iranian leadership, that the fatwa was still in effect, nothing happened, and so he started to think he was okay, he was safe. And then the thing is that Islamic jihadis are very patient. They don't give up the way Westerners do if they encounter some obstacles. They think they are part of a 1400-year struggle, and if they don't succeed at one point, Allah will give them victory later if they remain faithful. And so there's a tremendous incentive to them to keep at it. And so this ultimately paid off for them from their point of view, that somebody did try to kill Rushdie. And he really should have realized, had he studied Islam more closely, that the fatwa was never going to go away, and that no matter how peaceful everything seemed, he was never really safe.
Wow. Here's one article. This one is dated August 2022. Salman Rushdie had started to believe his life was normal again. Before he was stabbed, the author said a lot of people today live with similar threats to those made against him. When someone has a fatwa put against them, they may not know it, right? Is that correct? Usama Dakdok, my friend who speaks fluent, Usama speaks, from Egypt, speaks fluent Arabic. He has said to me, Brannon, you could have 3 or 4 fatwas on you, you wouldn't necessarily know it unless they
Yeah, that's absolutely so.
choose to publicize it. He said he laughed a couple months ago because I said Annie Cyrus, she's got 12. Her 12th one from Iran is reportedly for working with me as a journalist, and I bring her on here and I have her take the IRGC's social media and translate it for us and talk about Iran, and she's from Iran, so that reportedly got her 12th. And she did some research, and she said they're also tracking on you, Brannon. They're mentioning you and your organization in the dark web. She said, I don't know what kind you have, but you probably have some kind of fatwa. Either defund you, it doesn't have to be killed. It could be killed, it could be defund, who knows. But I asked Usama about it. He kind of laughed. He said, you think you're just now getting one of those? I said, I don't know. He said, well, don't you think that guy from Saudi Arabia had to have permission from an imam to come in there with his Quran and film it and then threaten you as he did with, sitting down in his car making a video with 5 guns and 2 semi-automatics? I guess I really didn't think about that. What are your thoughts? Do they have to get permission from an imam to do that kind of thing? How probable is it that, for instance, you have multiple fatwas on your head? You just don't know how many.
No, I don't. I remember actually once many years ago, back in the very early 2000s, I was in a website that's now defunct, revivingislam.com. You had to be a Muslim to get in and answer various questions about Islam and so on. And so I did that. I was under the guise of being a Muslim, and I went in and was searching around, and I happened to see somebody say, oh, yeah, Spencer is on the list. We have him on Al-Qaeda or whatever has him on the list. But I never saw the list, and this was never publicized. I just happened upon that in the depths of this website. And so, yes, indeed, you might never know. There's no reason that they have to publicize it because it could only alert the target. And that's, of course, what they don't want. But while it's true that a lot of these guys do have permission, and I think it's very likely that the guy who came and was waving his weapons around at your event did indeed have the blessing and the permission of an imam. At the same time, the Islamic law regarding blasphemy is very specific, that the death sentence for the blasphemer is to be carried out by the caliph. But in the absence of a caliph, then an individual Muslim can carry out the sentence without punishment, without fear of punishment from Islamic authorities. And we haven't had a caliph since the 1920s. And so what that essentially means is that somebody can kill somebody who they think is guilty of blasphemy and be justified in an Islamic context without having explicit permission from an authority.
Wow. Wow. Let's talk about Iran and Al-Qaeda. I had an article last night that I referenced that, here we go, U.S. confirms that Al-Qaeda top man is in Iran. I asked Annie Cyrus about this last night. What do you think this means, Robert?
Well, I'll tell you, the one thing that leapt out at me is that a lot of Western counterterror analysts assure us that Sunnis and Shia hate each other and will never work together. Now, Sunnis and Shia do hate each other. That is absolutely true. But the idea that they'll never work together is completely false. And the fact is that Al-Qaeda is a Sunni group. Saif al-Adil is a Sunni, but he's hiding out in Iran because of, there's an old expression that translates, my brother against my brother, and both of us against our cousin. And that is, I think, sums up the attitude that Sunnis and Shia have toward one another and toward infidels. We should remember that the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is Shia, also funds Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which are Sunni, because they hate the Israelis and they hate the Israelis more than they hate the Sunnis.
All right, and now what are you doing when it comes to watching what's going on in regards to Turkey, Syria, all these different conflicts and things going on, and alliances being made or attempted alliances? Give me your idea of what's happening in the Middle East.
Well, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, wants to restore the Ottoman Caliphate. if not in name, then in actuality. So he's saber rattling and making a lot of belligerent actions toward Greece on the western side. And then in Syria, he has actually occupied territory and is continuing a war against the Kurds in northern Syria because he wants to seize more of the area that once comprised the Ottoman Empire. He's been very explicit about this, about how the territories of the former Ottoman Empire belong by right to Turkey, and he intends to claim them. The world is paying very little attention to this, and I think doesn't really take him seriously, thinks he's just blustering when he says this. But what he's essentially doing is announcing that he is eventually, when he thinks the time is right, going to go to war against Greece and against other countries in that region.
Then, Robert, what do you make in regards to the desire for hate speech? You referenced it once already tonight. Tony Blair, he's been really pushing for this idea of hate speech over in Europe. What about the laws, blasphemy laws, laws not speaking against the prophet, if you will, at the UN? Where are we at in America, the UK, the UN, when it comes to labeling what you and I do as hate speech and criminal?
It's coming, Brannon. We have to be prepared for that. We already have now, right north of the border, the government of Canada has just appointed an Islamophobia czar, or czarina, I guess you could say, because it's a woman, Amina El-Gawabi, who has ties to all the usual groups that you would expect she has ties to. And she has made anti-Semitic statements and so on in the past. Just the kind of person you would expect that they would have appointed. But the thing is that obviously hate speech doesn't exist. Hate speech is just a term that the powerful use in order to silence the powerless, and that tyrannical governments use to silence those who question their tyranny. And this Islamophobia business is just one aspect of the effort of tyrannical governments to silence dissent. And so it's already now in place in Canada, and you can be sure, the rhetoric in Canada to put this office in, to set this office up, and it has a $5 million budget to start with, is that innocent Muslims are being attacked. Well, no innocent Muslims should be attacked, but there is no doubt that Amina El-Gawabi is going to be going after honest analysis of the motivating ideology behind jihad terror attacks, is going to be going after criticism of Sharia and saying this is the kind of thing that leads to these innocent Muslims being attacked, which is completely a spurious idea and would ultimately lead to the prohibition of criticism of anything, because it might lead to somebody being attacked. But it's on that basis that criticism of Islam will be silenced in Canada, and essentially Islamic blasphemy laws imposed upon Canadian society. And Canada, of course, is just the first step. Ultimately, these things are coming to Europe. The European Union has just also appointed an Islamophobia representative who's going to be doing the same thing in the European Union states. And of course, Joe Biden and his people that are running the administration are completely open to this idea. They have the big obstacle of the First Amendment. But once you get enough Supreme Court justices to say hate speech is not free speech, then they're in.
And why is it, in our closing moments here, Robert, why is it that we don't see more conservative groups booking you in to speak and to talk about this? That this is how they're going to bring down talk radio. This is how they're going to shut down conservative blogs and bloggers and broadcasters and even churches, shackle the pulpits, which everybody should be concerned about. Why is it that, like, you should be a keynote speaker at, like, CPAC? Why are you not, or someone like you, more prevalent as a keynote speaker at an organization like CPAC?
Well, I would expect that CPAC is compromised and is in on all this and is okay with it. And I don't say that lightly. I say that because of why I particularly, since you asked this question, am not at CPAC. I used to speak at CPAC. Several times I spoke there. But there is an individual who is very powerful in the conservative movement, Grover Norquist, who was involved with Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, the al-Qaeda financier, who I mentioned earlier, and he was giving money to al-Amoudi. He was all tied in with al-Amoudi's network, and I and a few other people called him out on it. Grover was very powerful with CPAC, and now I'm not at CPAC. And so that is an indication of what happens when you have people who buck the conservative establishment. The conservative establishment is not what a lot of people think it is. They're a lot more tied into what the left is doing and okay with it than many people realize. Former Congressman Tom Tancredo told me the same thing. He was in Congress. He was trying to drum up interest among Republicans to fight illegal immigration, and he found out they wanted it. They liked it. They were all in on it. They weren't interested in stopping it. A lot of them would pay lip service to stopping it to get elected, but then they wouldn't do anything about it when they were in Washington. And it's going to be the same thing with all this, with the hate speech laws and everything else.
I remember Tom Tancredo. He was out of Colorado, right?
That's right.
I was at CNP once when he was there, and seemed like a very genuine and nice man. I don't know what he's doing now. I have no idea what he's doing now.
Oh, he's retired now. And he actually put out his memoirs last year. The story of him fighting for immigration is all in there. You can find that book at Amazon. Fascinating book.
I should get him on and interview him about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's called I Was Trump Before Trump Was Cool. And
Wow.
in a certain sense, that's very true. He was the one who was fighting for America First principles when nobody else was.
Yep, he sure was. So at the end of the day, a lot of these Republicans are bought off by corporations, and the corporations want an open border, and many of the corporations are pushing for the North American Union to merge America, Canada, and Mexico into its own union. So the corporations want that. That's who put them there. They'll pay lip service, but at the end of the day, that's all it is.
Yeah, exactly. And so when it comes to hate speech, they don't want dissent any more than the left does. They want only their line to be heard, which is just what tyrannical regimes do. Because if you're going to institute some grand North American superstate, obviously voting is going to be impractical, well nigh impossible. You're going to have people with such radically different values. It's going to be an authoritarian state. And so you can't have the freedom of speech. You have to have something like so-called hate speech laws.
Let's look at the book cover again. I want to urge you guys to get it. There it is, by our good friend here, Robert Spencer. How is the book selling, by the way?
Very well. A lot of interest in this. I actually was surprised. People are, I think, waking up to really what is going on and how the left is indeed trying to foment a civil war, more than anybody would have thought just a few years ago.
Yeah. Well, great job. Great work. As always, thank you for all you're doing. Thanks for being with us. And, of course, his main website is jihadwatch.org, jihadwatch.org. Robert, thanks for being with us.
A pleasure, Brandon. Always good to talk to you.
You too, Robert. Robert's a good friend from a long time ago. Doing great work, folks. Support what he's doing. Get his book. Check it out. Give it as gifts. It's very important work Robert's doing.